This is the word of the Lord.
Keith, I'm just going to introduce you a little bit. It was many years ago that I heard Dr. Keith Suter on ABC radio. It was before I knew who he was. And I can't even remember what you were talking about, but I remember thinking, that's a smart guy. And I was very surprised and delighted to find that Keith is part of our presbytery. So, Keith, thank you so much for coming today to speak with us. You can either take this off or leave it on, up to you.
I might leave it on. I need both hands to speak. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be with you. Is the sound going all right? That's good. Excellent. Good Methodist voice. So the two readings that have been set down for today in the lectionary being used around the world relate to, one, the lamentation, in effect, of Habakkuk, an Old Testament figure, someone who is complaining about the state of the world. I think if he were to come back today, he would feel right at home, given all the problems that we've got, as Mary pointed out in her earlier prayers, with the suffering that's going on, with the issues of Ukraine, etc. And then in the Gospel reading, what we've got is Jesus again talking about the whole issue of wealth. And in this case, it's on Zacchaeus. We've recently dealt with, again from Luke, the whole issue of the rich young man who was being challenged to give his wealth away, and that was a difficulty for him. What's interesting to note is that there are more references to money in the Bible than to heaven. So the Bible is very much an economic textbook. And I have to emphasise that fact because I've been involved with the debate over economic justice for some decades, and I had a stoush with the then Premier of Victoria, Jeff Kennett, who said that the church should stay out of politics, should stay out of talking about economics. But when it comes to economics, we were there first. The secular profession of economics really only kicks in around the 18th century, particularly with Adam Smith and his book, The Wealth of Nations, in 1776. So when it comes to talking about wealth, we Christians were there first, and we've been there longest. But unfortunately, we tend to forget our heritage. And so what I want to do today is just to look at the whole issue of Christians and wealth. So going back to Habakkuk, he's complaining about the inequality, the suffering that he sees around him in society. And then in the reading that we've just had from Luke chapter 19, it's a story of Zacchaeus. Zacchaeus is a person who we assume was suffering from dwarfism, so a very short individual who had to climb a tree in order to see Jesus. He's also a tax collector for the Romans. So in fact, no one was going to help him see Jesus because he was running in a despised profession. He was collecting money, probably a crook as well, on behalf of the occupying power, the Romans. So he climbs up the tree, both because he's short and because the crowd around him won't help him see it. And then Zacchaeus undergoes this transformation, and he pledges that he will refund his ill-gotten gains. In fact, this is actually a description of restorative justice, which has now become so fashionable in some law and order circles. So what he is saying is that I will repay back more than I have stolen from people. I will repay them back. And so what we see here is Zacchaeus being transformed by Jesus and saying, I will share my wealth. And I acknowledge that I had got the wealth inappropriately. 2,000 years later, we still have this dilemma for all Christians, what to do with our wealth or lack of it. I said earlier that the Bible was the first ever economics textbook. Just to give you some of the examples that you can read in the Bible about how people have tried to deal with the issue of wealth. One, you see in Acts chapter 2, the description of the early Christian community. So remember, we see a time when the Christians are being persecuted by both the Romans and the Jewish authorities. And Christians were living in what we would call small, intentional communities. They were sharing their wealth. And because of the lifestyle that they lived, they actually attracted other people to join them. because they were practicing what they preached. It's a very interesting example for church growth. I'm involved with the church growth movement naturally, being connected with Wesley Mission. And of course, we're always well aware that, you've got these multi-mega preachers from the United States who go around in Rolls Royces, etc. So what they're doing is trying to say, well, become a Christian like me and you'll end up prosperous. These early Christians were the reverse. They weren't living in northwest Sydney. I won't make any references to people who might be there. I don't want to be involved in internecine warfare with other denominations. But the early Christians shared their possessions, and they grew as a result of the example which they showed to the rest of the community. They were helping people. Going back to my stoush with Jeff Kennett, it's worth bearing in mind that we Christians ran the world's first orphanages. Under Roman law, if you had a baby and you didn't want to keep the baby, you threw the baby away. And Christians went around the rubbish tips rescuing babies. We also ran the world's first hotel chain. Monasteries were built in Europe 1 day's walk apart from each other. So you would walk during the day and then spend the night at a monastery. So we were running the Hiltons 2,000 years before Hilton came along. So the churches ultimately became major players. But we go back to Acts chapter 2 and the sharing of the wealth. That's one model. Also, we can see, particularly in the Old Testament, the ban on usury. In other words, lending money at a rate of interest. This is bad news for the bankers because that's how they earn their money or make it, through the lending out of other people's money and charging a rate of interest. This is actually banned under early Christian thinking. It changed a bit when the Protestants came along because they found ways of getting around the whole question of being able to lend out money. But the ban still exists within Islamic societies, and it's a ban that goes back to early Jewish thinking. So technically the Jews shouldn't be involved in banking, and Muslims are still not involved technically in banking. When you get involved with an Islamic bank, you actually become a partner in the project rather than an investor. You become a partner. So that's another way of sharing the wealth. And then also, and this comes again from the Old Testament, is the whole question of redistribution of wealth. The year of Jubilee. So every 50 years, 7 times 7, the wealth of the Israelis, the Hebrews, would be redistributed. Now, the extent to which that occurred, we just don't know. It's clearly laid down in the Old Testament, but the extent to which it's actually practiced, we just don't know. But of course, some of us have been involved with the Jubilee campaign, which was to excuse the debt to third world countries. And that was a very extensive campaign. So that's the redistribution of wealth every 50 years. And that avoids the accumulation of wealth. The way that we now have this intergenerational wealth that just gets passed on from one generation to another. At one point, you had some countries that were trying to stop that by creating a level playing field for each new generation coming along. But then Australia led the developed Western world with scrapping inheritance taxes. Not even Ronald Reagan or George W. Bush could scrap the taxes in the United States, but we did so. So we are allowing the wealth then to accumulate, completely opposite of what was laid out in the Old Testament. As I say, the year of Jubilee remains controversial amongst the scholars as to the extent to which it took place. Then coming back to the period in which I was having the stoush with the Victorian Premier, it occurred over a document that we produced in the Uniting Church when I was then the General Secretary of the Uniting Church's Commission on Social Responsibility. And that commission linked up with the Catholic Commission for Justice and Peace, as it was then known, which linked up with the Anglican Social Responsibility Commission. And so we three put out the first ever ecumenical social justice statement. It was 1983, and it was called Changing Australia. Very controversial, partly because we, the authors, had not caught on with the bigger change which was occurring. I said this was, for me, such an interesting experience. I actually did my master's degree on looking at the Changing Australia controversy, because it was absolutely fascinating. When we were composing this, and we needed to have an idea of the different Christian thinking about wealth. The document that influenced us most was Rerum Novarum, which is 1891 from Pope Leo XIII. Now, this document, 1891, was written at a time when a lot of working-class Catholics were joining the trade union movement. And so the Pope put out this ecumenical statement saying, look, you don't need to join the trade unions. We in the church have been involved on economic justice for 1900 years at that time. It's a very interesting document on the whole question of the redistribution of wealth. So we actually recycled a lot of that into this social justice statement because the Anglicans and the Uniting Church didn't have all that much to compare with this Catholic social teaching. So we put out the social justice statement, and it occurred at a time when we were undergoing this massive change. Movement away from the government involvement in the economy, concerned about the underprivileged, concerned about the development of social housing. I'm reminded of that on the taxi through here, what used to be an area of social housing, now being privatised, being sold off by the government. And in this new era that we failed to detect, the new right economic rationalists were saying, forget about responsibilities to the community, you just look out for yourself. The meek might inherit the earth, but they're not going to get the mineral rights. Do unto others before they get a chance to do it unto you. And this is this new method of thinking which has now transformed our society in the last 40-odd years. And changing Australia was really a hangover from an earlier era, which saw government as having responsibility for the underprivileged in society, that saw people living within a community rather than as individuals seeking to maximise self-gain. So that was the Changing Australia controversy that I was involved in 40 years ago. That was the end of the one sort of dominant paradigm of economic thinking, and then we're moving into a whole new era of new right economic rationalism. And my view is that what we were doing was trying to get back to that early Christian thinking. And obviously that was reflected in the Pope's original statement from 1891. So to summarise so far, the Church has been involved with economics for 2,000 years. It has a heritage that goes back several thousand years when you look at some of the Jewish teaching in terms of the ban on lending money for a rate of interest, the whole question of Jubilee, the redistribution of accumulated assets. So the Church has had a long involvement in all of this. When I say the Church, I just mean the entire Christian Church. The problem for the Uniting Church is that we haven't at that time done much thinking on economic justice. That's what my commission was set up to establish. And the document that I found very useful from a Uniting Church point of view was actually a Methodist set of writings from John Wesley. And John Wesley was living at a time of the Industrial Revolution. He was also living at a time of massive disruption, just as we are. And John Wesley's attitude was summed up with the phrase, gain all you can, save all you can, and give all you can. In other words, gain all you can, you make as much money as you can, but an honest day's work for a fair day's pay. Secondly, save all you can. In other words, create a nation of people who are saving money. Very different from today when you think, we're encouraging you to go out, buy now, pay later. Everything's that charged to plastic, etc. We now have a level of personal indebtedness totally unprecedented in Australian history. We are very vulnerable to economic downturns because we are not saving as much as we can, we're spending as much as we can. And of course, wrecking the environment in the process. So gain all you can, save all you can, and then give all you can. In other words, be generous in terms of donations to charities, church work, etc. That was the challenge that John Wesley gave 200 years ago. And I think it still remains a good way of trying to operate your own finances. You gain as much as you can, a fair day's work for a fair day's pay. You save all you can, and then you give all you can. There are no easy answers to how we're to handle wealth. We go back, remember, to the story that we heard before about Luke, in Luke's Gospel, about the rich young man who had difficulty giving away his wealth. This morning we hear about Zacchaeus, the tax collector, who was able to give away that wealth. But the challenge for many Christians is living in today's society. I'm told you've got to be realistic, and therefore you need lots of money. Therefore you should make as much as you can and don't worry about anybody else in society. The problem is, over the long term, that corrodes society. You get the breakdown of society. We're seeing that in so many places around the world, and that was reflected in Mary's prayers for the people this morning. So just something to think about. John Wesley, gain all you can, save all you can, and then give all you can. We remain challenged by what we do with our money. And if we're going to be good Christians, then we need to be using our money responsibly. Let's come before the Lord in prayer. Renew your people, Lord, and renew our life in this place. Give us a new spirit of unity with all who follow Christ, and a new spirit of love towards all people. Bless the city in which we live, that it may be a place where honest dealing, good government, the desire for beauty, and the care for others all flourish. And bless this church, that what we know of your will may become what we do, and what we believe become the strong impulse of our worship and work. All this we ask through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen.